the editorial, first of three editorials of the day on the Times, which, because of the light reflection, it may not be clear, but let's read this. Gates whitewash. We pronounce this name Geidts, DT apostrophe and S. Now, it may be pronounced gay, but Gates whitewash sounds factually correct. We are starting part A of the KhoodeelaarTV television channel, only on the internet, not on satellite, not on terrestrial, not on cable. This is the KhoodeelaarTV television channel coming online from London in the UK within quotation marks. This is part A of the KhoodeelaarTV television channel, and the editions that we are broadcasting are headed by the flag, the banner, the declaration, BabyAngelGeronimo, the world's best witness, the world's most authentic witness to the corruption, criminality, law breaking by the cabal in the so-called UK, fronted by the congenital liar Boris Johnson. And this congenital liar is acknowledged as being congenital liar in this editorial in the Times, Friday the 7th of January 2022. And the headline to this editorial comment is Gates whitewash. Boris Johnson may have been exonerated by his ethics advisor. These are all contradictory. This Git who exonerates a congenital liar for another series of lies cannot be anything to do with ethics whatsoever. Over the redecoration of his Downing Street flat, that is Johnson's flat, but trust in public life has been further damaged. Now, if the Git has exonerated the congenital liar, then logically it should follow in that statement, that is, that trust in public life has been restored. But that's not the case. What the Times description of the heading says is that Boris Johnson may have been exonerated. Exonerated means that he's not guilty as charged, but he has been exonerated in a kind of acquittal. So that's the first part. And the middle part is by his ethics advisor over the redecoration of the Downing Street flat. And the conclusion is, but trust in public life has been further damaged. Now, this kind of bold use of but and the damage, this would be unthinkable in the kind of years during which the congenital liar Boris Johnson plotted with the collusion and the complicity of was aided and abetted by even the Times. He plotted to become the incumbent in the post that he is now incumbent in. And he plotted for years. Such was the kind of severity of his plotting, and such was the sense of impunity that he kind of gave out as he went about his plot to occupy number 10 Downing Street, in other words, to become the, quote, Prime Minister, unquote, of the, quote, United Kingdom, unquote, that even the dodgy Dave Cameron, dodgy is the word that we ascribe to Skinner. Skinner is the beast of Bolsover, as he is known as. So Skinner called Dave Cameron Dodgy Dave during the tenure of Dave in number 10 Downing Street. And when he did that, he was ousted from the day's proceedings in the House of Commons by then Speaker John Bercow. So a discredited Dave Cameron himself has recently updated his public references to Boris Johnson and said that Johnson has always been able to get away. Now, this is not something that has been said for the first time, but for that to be said by dirty Dave Cameron is significant, because he's somebody that is sunk in sleaze and corruption and abuse himself. So somebody that discredited, that morally discredited, finds Boris Johnson even more morally discredited. Think about that. That is the measure of the degeneration of Boris Johnson, the dishonesty of Boris Johnson, and the disservice to trust in public life that he has been perpetrating. As the editorial Gates whitewash in today's Times concludes, observes, asserts, and the Times editorial is saying that the Gates should resign because there is no chance of him getting the due independence that his so-called remit needs him to have. It is saying, in return for his latest whitewash, he, that is Git, obtained a weak commitment from the Prime Minister to a swift review of his own, that is Git's, powers in that post. And within quotes, Lord Git should insist on the full implementation of the Committee on Standards in Public Life's recommendation that his, that is Git's, role be put on a statutory footing, and that he, Git, be given the power to launch investigations and publish his findings. And if he, Git, doesn't get this, he should resign. Now that last kind of 3-word phrase by the Times in the editorial is complete fantasy. This gate is not going to resign on a point of principle, because his tenure is conditional on his delivering kind of rubber stamp clearance for the congenital liar Johnson. So let's look at the other editorial pieces. The second one is monumental decision, which is the jury clearing the 4 white persons in Bristol of any crimes involved in their participation in the removal of Colston's statue. Now, we are interested in the editorial not because of the actual incident, but because of the fact that the Times actually recognizing the constitutional relevance of the Magna Carta. Now, during many years of correspondence, which the criminals involved in the editorial and publishing decisions on the legal websites, I published dozens and dozens and dozens of comments on the law, on the Constitution, on many websites, including 3 or 4 kind of so-called legal websites. And while I was doing that, I came across more than one response or a comment about the Magna Carta. And I think this one was posted by one of the licensed law trading criminals on the website, the Solicitors website, Solicitors Journal. And that particular, from memory, I'm not looking at it because it was some years ago, but that particular comment, hostile comment about the Magna Carta, was as follows: that any writer or commenter or observer who talks about the Magna Carta must be dismissed, must be ruled out of any kind of having any say on any platform, because anyone who refers to the Magna Carta is obviously ignorant about the law, about the Constitution, about the legal system. That is roughly what I'm saying in paraphrases and from memory. Essentially, the comment was dismissive of anyone who referred to the Magna Carta. Now, I'm not a fan of the Magna Carta in the sense that religious fanatics are fans of certain statements, certain doctrines, certain kind of phrases. But this Magna Carta has become so important, so central a part of the framework of references to the UK Constitution that I have to explain this reason. And the fact that the Magna Carta has become relevant as a reference, as a point of reference, shows the complete poverty and complete corruption of the English judicial system, so-called, as it now exists, or as it has existed over the years, including during the period when that moron condemned anyone who made any references to the Magna Carta. Carta is charter, and Magna is big. So the big charter was introduced when the English kind of domain, the kind of correspondence, the communications, the official language was Latin. In other words, also known as Law Latin. The Magna Carta was the big charter. Now, one of the reasons why I devised many phrases, including the phrase of the gullibles. And I have updated the phrase, the Little Englanders. One of the reasons why I have done that or done those is because of the transparent stupidity, manifest idiocy, and brazen ignorance and lack of knowledge on the part of the most of the people that claim otherwise to know the law, know the constitution, know the history, know the rights and the wrongs, and know the procedures and all the rest of it. Now, in decades of my confrontation with licensed law traders, barristers, solicitors, solicitors, legal executives, members of the court judiciary, and the administration personnel in various English kind of court offices, it is quite clear that what dominates these people and their behavior and their decisions, their roles, is absolute ignorance. When you look at the picture, the images of some of the kind of members of the judiciary, you see on the background in the kind of piles of volumes. These are supposed to be volumes containing printed kind of sources that constitute together the law. And you assume, not at the time of the still photographs because you can't move, these are still photographs, fixed. So you extend the logical kind of dexterity, and you assume that they are frantically kind of consulting those volumes behind them before they come to a point about referring to the law. That is the assumption. But you hardly actually ever witness them doing that. Even when you are in the presence of them, you are having, when it comes to the licensed law traders and you are having a meeting with a quote barrister, that is called conference. The barrister, you meet the barrister with the licensed law trading solicitor or solicitor. Solicitor, the barrister, and the client, if you like, or the litigant. And together, the three elements constitute what is called the conference. And it's a bogus thing. It is never actually truthful. And it goes beyond the time even before the kind of Magna Carta, or since the Magna Carta. It has been going on for hundreds of years. And the fact that this is the kind of most important aspect of the proceedings or the deliberations or the exchanges undermines any claim that there is due process or due diligence or due regard for due process and rule of law, etc., etc. Because at the conferences, they don't really examine the relationship between the operation of due process and the rule of law and the right of the innocent until proven guilty, etc., etc. Because, for example, one Ken lying still Livingstone, conspired with a Camden councillor, a Bengali councillor in Camden, Roy Shaw, who is now deceased, and to have a political prosecution against our movement. I had a number of meetings with a licensed law trading barrister, completely unnecessary. I had about 4 or 5 meetings with the moron, and we went over the same kind of factual references. And he was doing that, I think he was doing that in order to increase the claim that he was going to make for legal aid fees under legal aid, if you like. And the same happened with the solicitor. I had about 12 meetings about the same set of facts. Like it happens with the dentists. If you go to the dentist, they will make more than 2 or 3 appointments when it actually, at most, they should have only 2 appointments. So what I'm outlining there is the corruption in the publicly paid kind of services, if you like. And the intention, the agenda, the purpose is not to deliver the service, but to prolong the pretext, the excuses, so that they can make claims to higher amounts of money under the scheme, which is one of the reasons why the quote legal aid has been discredited more than it had been before. And the legal aid system is discredited because the claim by those who oppose legal aid, who oppose kind of access to quote judicial remedies for everyone, they say that the kind of recipient of the legal aid, which the misdescribe always, they confuse the litigant as the recipient, which is never the case. It's the licensed law trading barrister or soul cheater who received the legal aid money, never the litigant, who is only central because their name and the details are misused in the corrupt system. The system is corrupt from the word go. So when David Neuberger told the Australian gathering in July 2017 that the Access to Justice Act that was passed during the Labour Party's incumbents in government was to blame for the lack of access to justice within quotation marks, was available for ordinary people. Neuberger was confusing the facts and confusing the laws and confusing the background and the context and the reality, as do the Daily Mail, as do the daily bribing Boris Johnson crowd, the daily dirty digger scum, and the daily Beaverbrook Express. Legal aid is never available to the litigant. Legal aid is only available to the licensed law trading so-called professionals, who then become motivated solely by the amount of legal aid money that they can reap by getting involved in the so-called representation, which is misrepresentation, in fact, of a particular client. So you go back to the Magna Carta in the monumental decision, that is the second editorial in the Times dated the 7th of January 2022 about the Bristol Statute of Colston, about which 4 white persons were prosecuted and have been kind of acquitted. Because the Times says that there is no dispute over what happened in Bristol on 7th of June 2020, when protesters toppled the bronze statue of a 17th century slave trader and philanthropist and tipped it into the harbor. Footage of the moment Edward Colston's statue was brought down with ropes and high fives was played at the trial of 4 defendants. None contested their identities or participation, and yet, after 3 hours of deliberation, a jury found them not guilty of criminal damage, accepting the defense that the statue was so offensive it constituted a hate crime against the city. And the Times says it was Magna Carta's reference to the lawful judgment of his peers as a condition for the loss of liberty that laid the groundwork for the right to jury trial. And it was in 1670, during Colston's lifetime, that Chief Justice Vaughan freed jurors imprisoned for refusing to convict the Quaker preachers, William Penn and William Mead, for unlawful assembly. In doing so, Chief Justice Vaughan established the right of juries to give their verdict according to their convictions, a principle enshrined in a commemorative plaque at the Old Bailey. So-called perverse verdicts, which appear to contradict evidence given in court, have a rich history, from Penn and Mead to Clive Ponting, acquitted of leaking classified documents about the sinking of the Argentine warship General Belgrano. In each case, the jury reached a different conclusion to that of the state. The most sustained campaign of perverse verdicts was mounted by American juries who refused to convict Underground Railroad activists who helped black slaves escape bondage in the South. Now, Mr. Shapps, the current Transport Secretary in the cabal fronted by Boris Johnson, suggested that the verdict in Bristol had endorsed criminal damage as an acceptable form of protest, insisting that monuments like Colston's could only be removed by a democratic process. Yet Ryan Graham, one of the 4 defenders, argued that democracy had well and truly broken down after 3 decades of political deadlock over what to do with the statue, and its plaque describing the slave trader as one of the most virtuous and wise sons of the city. Plans for a new plaque were derailed in 2018 by the Society of Merchant Venturers, the guild that lobbied Parliament in 1698 to open up the slave trade and erected Colston's statue in 1895. Nevertheless, the toppling of the statue was an act of unjustified vandalism. The correct course, whatever Miss Graham thinks, was for the people of Bristol, through a democratic vote, to decide what to do with it. The danger is that this judgment will encourage others to destroy statues they disapprove of. Even so, it is better not to quibble with the jury's verdict. Jacob Rees-Mogg, leader of the Commons and an arch traditionalist, concluded yesterday that the jury system was one of our greatest monuments and such an important protector of our liberties that we must take the rough with the smooth. And the Times concludes, he is right. Now, going back to David Neuberger. Neuberger is the name because He held the post of the first president of the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court was erected to continue the kind of linguistic form after the House of Peers was kind of discontinued as the Supreme Court, as the de facto highest court in the land in the UK. So Neuberger said, as reported by Martin Bentham in the Evening Standard on the 4th of July 2017, that once Brexit was done, effectively what he was saying, once Brexit was implemented, and our judges, to use the phrase used by Neuberger, had got back to using our common law devices, as he said, things would be rosy, wonderful. Now, we focus on the common law devices phrase. If we look at the list of prosecutions over the last, let's say, 100 years in England, prosecutions, that is, criminal prosecutions, we can find that there was no use of the common law devices to establish justice. What common law devices actually mean is the discretion available to the judges to do according to their prejudice. Now, on the facts, more than 99% of the decisions by the English criminal judges have been criminal, racist, unjust, unfair. So when Neuberger said that our common law devices, he was lying. And because the agenda that Martin Bentham has been serving as the Home Affairs editor at the Evening Standard is as an agent of the state, Bentham didn't actually question or contextually examine in his report dated the 4th of July 2017 the fact that what Neuberger was saying was very shallow and was not justified by the accessible evidence, available public evidence of the jurisprudence. That is to say, the actual theme, the characteristics of the judicial decisions made over the last 100 years or 200 years, 300 years, whatever. Because common law goes back hundreds of years. So, and the other thing is that when the common law kind of judge the accusations or allegations against black-skinned persons or African people or Asian people in the courts, they somehow find a way, quote, common law way, to find faults with these defendants. And this is something that is not found in the acquittal of the 4 white defendants. It's incredible that the prosecutors chose to prosecute these 4 white defendants in Bristol. Because had they decided to have a mixed kind of group of defendants, it would be very interesting to see what the jurors did. And if they had only prosecuted a group of black defendants, it would be even more interesting to see what the jurors would have done. But they didn't do that. And it was a typical kind of act of political prosecution. Now, we haven't got in front of us the transcripts of what actually was said during the trial. If and when the transcript is available, we shall go into more detailed examination of what happened. But this was very odd in a setting where the Colston statue was dropped into the harbor by a mixed kind of group of people, that is to say, racially mixed people, people of mainly African origins, and then white kind of persons. And yet the prosecutor chose to prosecute only the four ones. I mean, this is absolutely very telling and significant. Now, the Times has done the thing about the jurors. And this is to be seen against the two statements made about the decision to acquit. One is a statement by Grant Shapps, and the other is the statement as reported by various news outlets, websites, including The Guardian's, that Sylvie Bermann, who was known as Sylvie Fernandez, is of Indian origin. And she is one of the most discredited, self-seeking, ethnic mental slaves. She is now the occupant in the post of Attorney General. And according to the latest kind of statements that we have accessed on the internet, she is considering, she is Sylvie Bermann, who she is now married to a white man called Bermann. Before she married him, she was called Fernandez. And she was even more right-wing and stupid than Priti Patel. That says something. Now, these are mental slaves that are kind of in the category of Trevor Terrible Phillips, who told his own biological brother Mike Phillips, "Shut up, Mike," when he, Trevor Terrible Phillips, was chairing a public relations gathering organized to exonerate Peregrine Warstone. Now, Peregrine Warstone was that happened about 40 years ago, was in post as the editor of the Sunday Telegraph. Now, we shall come to more about Peregrine Warstone when we discuss the latest edition of Private Lie, which does contain a detailed report about Brilopad Andrew Neil, who had a libel case against Peregrine Warstone. We shall come to that a bit later. Now, these are all to do with legal. This is the world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street, but this is also the world exclusive comprehensive diagnosis of constitutional law in the context of the UK and the world. So we shall be talking about Peregrine Warstone. Now, Peregrine Warstone at that time in the 1980s, early 1980s, was being condemned. Now, it is the easiest thing to condemn a racist editor of a racist newspaper, because every day they run, or every edition, they run racist pieces. That is what makes them racist, so kind of predictably racist. And Peregrine Warstone was one of the worst racists to edit the paper, but it's very difficult to compete or compare races. Like Charles Moore was another racist who was connected with the Sunday Telegraph as a columnist. And the same Charles kind of Moore is continuing in his racist mode as a denier of the truth, because he's one of the very few people who are writing to support Brenda's knighthood given to Tony Blair. So going back to Peregrine Waston and Trevor Phillips, I mean, that is the kind of mode, the mental frame. Trevor Terrible Phillips kind of embodies the kind of slave mentality, mental slavery that Suella Braverman or Suella Fernandez and Priti Patel do. So Suella Braverman, as she is now, is reportedly considering an appeal to the Court of Appeal against the Bristol jury acquitting the 4 white defendants in the Colston Statute demolition case. And the case was mainly that they committed criminal damage. Now, the Bristol executive mayor, Marvin Rees, has been reported as saying that his job as the mayor at the expense of Bristol was to hold the city of Bristol together. Now, he is a black man of African origin. It would be more than justifiable to expect him to comment on slavery, comment on the role that Colston had played, on which basis his statue was treated as an abomination of the city and its people. And yet, Rees avoided referring to the trial, referring to the actual demolition or throwing of the statue into the harbor. And it is not a coincidence, because Marvin Rees had to be particularly mentally servile in order to be chosen as the candidate for the Labour Party to be the executive mayor at the expense of Bristol. The same, because soon after he was, quote, elected, Jeremy Corbyn, who was just recently elected leader himself, went out of his way to praise Marvin Rees. Now, why is that significant? Because Corbyn was trying to find a target with which to, quote, promotionally ingratiate himself in order to show that he was not a racist, and he was quite open to praising as a black person as the mayor in the name of the Labour Party. Why was that necessary? Because he wanted to find that excuse, a diverting excuse, so that he wouldn't have to comment on the election of Sadiq Khan, which had happened about the same time, if not on the same day. Now, as we say on the evidence, Jeremy Corbyn is an idiot, because while it served his purpose, which showed that he was very narrow-minded and he was not active intellectually to comment on the constitutional implications of having an elected mayor. He was rather trying to have a go at Sadiq Khan by refusing to endorse Sadiq Khan, congratulate Sadiq Khan, and went out of his way to congratulate in a lengthy statement aimed at Marvin Rees, but actually aimed at a deviation. Because Corbyn was a London constituency MP, And Sadiq Khan's post was a London post. Going to Bristol, instead of talking about the London version of the elected mayor, showed that Corbyn was being petty-minded and was stupid. More importantly, Corbyn should have talked about the democratic implication or the implications against democratic accountability created by this foisting, imposing of the elected mayor corruption and crooked post. Corbyn never did. And that is where the problem lies. It is not true, as Corbyn's kind of gang kind of claim, that Corbyn democratically is better than Starmer. Evidence shows that Starmer and Corbyn are both not fit for purpose democratically, because both Starmer and Corbyn support this anti-democratic, dictatorial, fascistic denial of local democracy. That is the elected mayor post. And there is nobody in the Labour Party, there is nobody among the elected members of parliament in the name of the Labour Party, that is UK-wide, and there is nobody in any locality, any local council, any local borough who is even vocal about the existence, the fact of the elected mayor post, let alone critical of the role being played by each of the elected mayor post holders. So, for example, in the Private Lie, which is the first edition of Private Lie for this year, what they are doing in the kind of annual, they do a kind of annual list of councils in the Rotten Borough or Rotten Boroughs kind of section or column. This time it is section because it goes more than one page. So it's Rotten Boroughs page has become Rotten Borough section. And one of the entries is the reproduction of the piece that they ran during the 2021 year about a Tower Hamlets councillor who had unintentionally, that is the assumption, unintentionally kind of broadcast he's taking a shower while he was in the nude. And the broadcast happened because he had switched on his mobile and it was streaming as he was in various states of nudity. And according to the Private Lie, which doesn't really condemn him, but kind of mocks him by saying that fellow councillors who he was connected with because of the contacts list, I suppose, were waving at him and were hollering. Waving and hollering is not the kind of phrase that you would use about Tower Hamlets. It's a middle-class bourgeois kind of thing, and all indications suggest that the councillor concerned was probably a white one, not a Bangladeshi one, but we cannot guarantee because the Private Lie has not published the identity of the person. So we have posted several tweets and we have said that Tower Hamlets is a corrupt council and stupid council, but on the list of its corruption and stupidity and dishonesty must be added the word nudity. And when we say that, nudity, we of course literally refer to that particular episode, but we also refer to the term nudity in an euphemistic way. because there is no pretense, there is no denying the fact that Tar Hamlets Council is shallow and unaccountable. Now, we have been recently calling the councillors in Tar Hamlets politically dead. That is because the operation of the corrupt post of elected mayor is continuing, and all these statements, public statements, are coming from the crook, John Biggs, who is incumbent as the corrupt mayor. And there is no kind of contest, there is no contradiction of Biggs by any elected councillor. So the elected councillors in Tar Hamlets are behaving like little pygmies, political pygmies, even shorter heighted than Biggs himself, who was described correctly in The Guardian in April 2018 as the diminutive John Biggs. Now, these political pygmies who are elected councillors are even more diminutive in implication than the diminutive John Biggs was. And the diminutive John Biggs was a description used in The Guardian in April 2018 by a former Lambeth councillor who became a journalist on The Guardian. So that was published on the 22nd of April 2018 on The Guardian Online records that is dated 22nd of April. And it's the Guardian website says that this article is more than 3 years old. And it says the Labour faces new challenge from old foes in Tar Hamlets vote. And I've got a picture of John Biggs with the caption, John Biggs says, Labour is the only party that represents the borough as a whole. And what as a whole? So that's the Guardian's piece. Byline 2, a person called Dan Sabag, S for sugar, A-B-B-A-G-H. And it's dated on Sunday, the 22nd of April, 2018. And the second paragraph of his piece, as it appears online, reads, outside the school is the diminutive figure of John Biggs, the incumbent directly elected mayor. But the Labour politician's path to the top job in the borough that contains the gleaming towers of Canary Wharf and the traditional East End has been anything but easy. He won with 55% of the vote in a 2015 by-election. After the independent mayor from 2010, Lutfur Rahman was disqualified by an election court for, among other offences, telling local Muslims it was their spiritual duty to vote for him and giving out grants inappropriately. Now, that is a mild version of the allegations against Lutfur Rahman that have been around for almost the entire period, starting from October 2010 when Lutfur Rahman first got in, until now, that Lutfur Rahman committed lots and lots and lots of crimes and offences and wrongs. Now, the point of referring to this again in this particular edition is this. If due process and rule of law actually were practiced, then some criminal prosecutions would have taken place by now, including against Luther-Roman, based on the publicly available allegations against Luther-Roman. But there has been no prosecution, not against Luther-Roman, not against anybody else. Now, during the kind of consideration by Richard Morey as the election commissioner of the petition details, particulars of the reasons for petitions that the four signatories had made, during the actual hearing that took place for weeks before the 23rd of April 2015, the date when Morey concluded and ruled that Luther-Roman was to be ousted from the post with immediate effect because he had been, let's see what Morey said. So this is the one, this case against Luther-Roman, and the case reference neutral citation number 2015 EWHC 1215, Queens Bench Division, case number M stroke 350 stroke 14. So it's fairly detailed kind of copy text. And we shall focus on the corruption. And Morey does go into some details about some of the factors. Now, there is enough allegations. Enough of the allegations against Luther-Roman were accepted by Richard Morey. That is the point. And yet, no prosecution has taken place. It's not like there were rumors. It was the ruling, the contents of the ruling made by the man in post as the election commissioner. So when we talk about Marvin Rees in Bristol, or Sadiq Khan in London, or Luther Rahman in Tower Hamlets, or Andy Burnham in Manchester, Greater Manchester, we're talking about the people in those constituencies or those areas whose say and whose rights are directly impacted. In the case of Tower Hamlets, because of the case, people, including the most vocal of the conservative councillors in Tower Hamlets Council, Peter Golds, regardless of his politics, regardless of his racism, he has been on the record. He has been more on the record than anybody else as a councillor. He has made public many aspects of his concern that nobody has been prosecuted. Peter Golds is the only councillor that has actually come on the record repeatedly saying that nobody has been prosecuted. I mean, Peter Golds is not a lone operator because he's very closely connected with Eric Pickles, and he is very widely known in Tower Hamlets and in the relevant circles as somebody in the Conservative Party who has got a wide network of connections within the Conservative Party. So why has Peter Golds been ignored? He's not a Bangladeshi, and he's not an African, he's not a Muslim. All of those are targets of his attacks. He's a very much an indigenous white person of whatever faith or no faith. And he has made the largest number, longest list of complaints that he has made against Lutfer Rahman. Although he was not a member of this 4 petitioners group, he has made more extensive statements against Lutfer Rahman than anybody else. Now, if it is true, as Ted Jory promoted Peter Golds as being, because Jory praised Peter Golds routinely as if they belong to the same kind of group of soul mates. And he even went to the fact that Peter Golds was very well regarded in the Conservative Party. One of the manifestations of that assertion came in the form of the debate that was held under the auspices of the House of Commons, but held in a separate building. It was the debate in January. This is January 2022, but that was in January 2013. And that was a debate that was sponsored by a Conservative MP who had been, not at that time, but who had been before that date, a member of the Greater London Assembly. And that member of Parliament moved the kind of debate held in a separate building, not in the actual Houses of Parliament, but it was a debate under the banner of the House of Commons. And that debate was headed, what do the monitoring officers do? Let's see what the debate said. So what the debate talked about, focus on the role of the monitoring officers, and it was a debate sponsored by and initiated by Robert Neal. Now, Robert Neal is the MP for Bromley and Chislehurst. And his Facebook post is 3 hours old at this time, which is, what time is it? 22:39. We are accessing this. And Robert Neal is posting, his latest post on his Facebook account is on his response to the reported death of Jack Dromey, of whom he says a thoroughly decent and genuine person, liked and respected across the House of Commons, and a dedicated public servant. Our thoughts and prayers are with Harriet Harman and their family. And the previous post on the Facebook is about Crown Prosecution Service, and there is a picture of Bob Neal speaking on the floor of the House of Commons. This is Robert Neal. So, Robert Neal, let's say what we can find. So, what Robert Neal said about Isabella Freeman. I'm looking for that particular quotation. So this was the debate headed on the 16th of January. It was Wednesday, 16th of January 2013, and Robert Neal started because the event was chaired by Philip Hollowbone, and it said, well, it's quoting it at the beginning. Robert Neal: thank you, Mr. Hollowbone. I'm delighted to see you in the chair, not least because you were a borough councillor in my constituency before you moved to your current constituency. Most of us have had direct personal experience of local government over a number of years. I sought a debate on this subject because the coalition agreement set out clearly the government's intention to remove what, by common consent, I think, had become regarded as a top heavy and excessive standards regime. It was debated at some length when the Localism Act 2011 went through Parliament, a process in which I had a certain personal involvement. And there was a communication from Peter Lilly on Robert Neal getting that debate. And Robert Neal kind of rubs Lilly's back in return, in gratitude. And he makes a long statement. Now, the part of this statement or interventions that Robert Neal made contains a naming of Isabella Freeman, which is what I am looking for. Isabella Freeman and Tower Hamlets Council. And it Now, let's say, while I'm looking for it, that Robert Neal is an opportunist careerist who is no longer, as far as I know, practicing as a licensed law trader. His license is as a licensed barrister. But he's not a moral kind of leader. He's a bureaucratic leader and a fixer. All of that is relevant and factual, but not critical to this particular reference he makes. He says, let me give just two more Tower Hamlets examples to conclude. One involves a complaint. I'm glad to say that nothing came of it in the end, but it still took time and investigation from Councillor Alibor Chowdhury, the cabinet member for resources in Tower Hamlets, who Alibor Chowdhury is a regular complainant against the leader of the conservative group, Councillor Goulds. An interim chief executive had been appointed. In the council meeting, speeches were made welcoming that officer to that post. During the debate, Councillor Goulds referred to the fact that he was looking forward to appointing a proper chief executive in due course. That was the subject of a complaint on the basis that it showed disrespect to the acting chief executive as well as bias. The acting chief executive actually wrote saying, "It does no such thing. I didn't feel in the least bit offended by that." It was pretty clear that Councillor Goulds was referring to a substantive appointment being made in due course, which everybody would wish to see. The fact that the issue was dragged through the standards regime in Tower Hamlets suggests that not just old mindsets, but questionable mindsets were being applied. A further complaint was then raised. Interestingly, three complaints were all made within about a month of each other. And the same cabinet member was party in each case. In that case, the allegation related to the matter that is now working its way through the first tier tribunal. A third complaint was made, this time about a member's suggestion. It is made by the same leader of the conservative group, as it happens, that a ward be named. It is a sensitive issue locally whether the ward is called Spitalfields in Bangla Town or Spitalfields. But the fact that it should trigger a complaint of racism is well beyond anything that the provisions were intended to do. The complaint was ultimately taken no further, but a great deal of public money went into dealing with it. Any proportionate system of monitoring would surely have weeded it out at an early stage. As I say, the same council spent £18,000 investigating the two opposition party leaders. At the same time, the monitoring officer declined to investigate complaints against members of the party supporting the mayor, that is Lutfur Rahman. And all those cases raised a specific matter in relation to Tower Hamlets. However, they also raise a specific important point, which I hope the minister will be able to clarify, about the use or perhaps abuse of the transitional provisions, which were intended essentially to enable members who might be involved in an outstanding complaint to clear their names by going to the first tier tribunal. I do not know how many such instances, if any, you have on record of attempts to use the transitional period in that rather extraordinary way, but it is clearly not what Parliament intended. And then he says, I hope that I have done enough to give a flavor of the areas of concern that I want to set before the House. I do not, in any spirit of criticism of the government, I do not, I do that not in any spirit of criticism of the government, because they have been doing the right thing, and there was broadly a measure of consensus in the House about wanting to ensure that we have proper standards, making sure that our public affairs at a local level are conducted honestly and transparently, having good quality candidates from all backgrounds coming forward for election, and enabling voters to believe that their members can do and say things that make a difference, are difficult to the health of the difference. I'll read that particular sentence again. Making sure that our public affairs at a local level are conducted honestly and transparently, having good quality candidates from all backgrounds coming forward for election, and enabling voters to believe that their members can do and say things that make a difference, are critical to the health of local democracy. All of that was clearly the government's intention when it carried out the reforms, and it was clearly Parliament's intention when the new arrangements were put in place. I hope that we will be able to use this debate to reinforce and clarify the message that the new regime is about empowering members, not inhibiting them, and that advice to the contrary is incorrect and should no longer be given out. The department should use its good offices, working with local government association and local government world generally, to ensure that members are not subject to the kind of unintended and inaccurate pressure that undermine our shared objectives. Now, as I said, he's not a very rigorous moral champion of anything. He's a party person who is using the personality that is attached to, latched onto the Conservative Party. So he does mention Peter Golds, as I said before I came to read this particular debate or read from the record of Hansard about this report. And in passing, Robert Neil actually makes a false statement crediting Boris Johnson, because what he was doing, that was in January 2013. So assuming that the assertions by Jennifer Arcuri and others that the affair Johnson began with her started in 2012. So by the time this debate took place in January 2013, Robert Neil was making a false promotional statement about Boris Johnson, because he's saying that Ken Livingstone always had meetings with employees present who recorded the minutes. But the facts that have come out now is that Livingstone was complying with the rules, but Johnson, when he succeeded Livingstone, had contempt, as Jennifer R. Couriers recounted, for the records, because Johnson has been boasting, saying that it's my city. I do what I like. So here is another bit in Bob Neal's reference to Tower Hamlets, and this one is actually about Isabella Freeman. Let's read the paragraph before he comes to Isabella Freeman. Other councils have seen even more striking and worrying examples, and I particularly want to refer to the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. That authority, that is Tower Hamlets, has a directly elected mayor. He is an independent, but it is well known that he has close connections with the Respect Party. The mayor is supported by sufficient independent members to ensure that he has the blocking third to get the necessary budgets and the mayoral policies through. However, throughout his time, there has been a history of vexatious complaints against members of the opposition, Conservative and Labour parties. Labour is actually the largest party, made by members of the mayor's cabinet. Councillors appointed by the mayor to his cabinet have made complaints, particularly against the leaders of the Labour and Conservative groups. Sometimes complainants have not come to fruition, or complaints have not come to fruition. In other circumstances, they have. That causes real concern. The monitoring officer of Tower Hamlets, Isabella Freeman, is also the assistant chief executive for legal services. And the monitoring officer is also the person who advises the mayor. There is now a situation in which the monitoring officer who advises the mayor and polices the regime regularly investigates complaints by a member of the mayor's cabinet. On the other hand, complaints against members of the group who support the mayor have not been taken forward for investigation. Now, that is absolute corruption. So, in that case, the monitoring officer is herself in dispute with her employer, the authority, and there is apparently an industrial tribunal case ongoing at the time in January 2013. But the monitoring officer still sits in and carries out her function, even though they involve councillors who may be witnesses to those proceedings. Tower Hamlets has reached the extraordinary stage of members from several parties passing a motion to have certain disciplinary steps taken in relation to the monitoring officer. We might have thought that the monitoring officer would have withdrawn from the meeting at that point. Instead, she insisted on remaining and noted what was said by every member, which hardly gives the impression of an unbiased, open, and transparent approach by the monitoring officer Isabella Freeman. Freedom of information requests in relation to only two of the complaints have revealed that some £6,000 of public money was spent on investigating a complaint against the leader of the Conservative group, and that some 12,000 was spent in relation to a complaint alleged against the leader of the Labour group. No such complaints have been taken forward in the same way against the group that supports the mayor, that is Lutfur Rahman. That may be a particularly egregious example. At the same time, however, members raised complaints with the monitoring officer about a highly partisan publication, East End Life, which is the subject of a great controversy, and the monitoring officer responded that everything that the mayor had put in that publication was in order. The same monitoring officer gave advice that the mayor was not obliged to answer certain questions from members in the council in relation to the exercise of his functions because that might infringe his human rights. That, frankly, brings the standards regime, which we all want properly and proportionately exercised, into serious disrepute that is not in anyone's interest. The matter that has arisen in relation to Tower Hamlet seems, on the face of it, to be frankly scandalous. It involves one important case that comes back to the whistleblower point. An opposition councillor raised an issue concerning an applicant for a senior post in the council, and it was demonstrated that that applicant's CB was inaccurate in an important and material respect. The applicant had been obliged to resign from a previous employment, and that was not placed on their CB. That achieved a degree of national and regional publicity. Not surprisingly, the result was a complaint by the same member of the mayor's cabinet, who was a frequent source of the complaints, against that member who complained about that particular applicant. That was investigated, and the member set out in considerable detail their side of the matter. The hearing took place within weeks of the abolition of the Standards Board regime, and the member was not present. The upshot, I have to be careful what I say, was that within days of the regime being swept away, rightly, by the will of Parliament, the Standards Committee, which I understand consisted predominantly of the members who supported the mayor, that is Lutfur Rahman, referred the matter to the first tier tribunal, where it remains. The purported view of that seems to be that in relation to a complaint that was some 2.5 to 3 years old, never mind its merits, there was a desire, frankly, to invoke suspension of a leading critic of the mayor. That was why it was being taken to the first tier tribunal, which refused to entertain it. Now I gather there may be attempts to appeal that. That sort of abuse of the system brings local government into disrepute. It is right to have that on the public record because that is not how the system is intended to be used. I hope the minister will confirm that the government's intention has been that as of July 1st, the ability to suspend or disqualify a member should not be exercised in the standards regime, but that instead such a power is exercisable when the criminal offense of failing to disclose a pecuniary interest which came into force on the same day is committed. The case that I mentioned had nothing to do with a pecuniary interest of any kind. A councillor was doing what many people would regard as their duty by pointing out something that might have been seriously misleading in relation to an important, sensitive public appointment. And so on. Now, this is the main kind of content that I have read from that particular debate held in January 2013. And this is a quotation these are quotations from the speech of Robert Neal as recorded on Hansard. And he mentions Peter Gould, he mentions Alibor Chaudhry, he mentions Isabella Freeman, and he doesn't mention the name of the person. And essentially, he mentions Peter Gold's, in the context of being a genuine, legitimate source of the complaints against the regime fronted by Luthvaraman. Now, as I said before, all the allegations against Luthvaraman that were contained and that are contained in the ruling against him by Richard Morey, dated the 23rd of April 2015. All the allegations against Luthvaraman remain on the records, and also some aspects of the allegations have been periodically updated in context. The question that Peter Gold has repeatedly put in the public domain is this: how come that none of the crimes committed either by Luthvaraman or by others, including Luthvaraman, none of the crimes has been prosecuted? And that question shows that the Crown Prosecution Service as well as the police are not doing the jobs that they are expected or supposed to do. And that is, again, going back to Jeremy Corbyn, promoting the election of Marvin Rees in 2016 in Bristol. Marvin Rees has now commented on the jury's clearing of the 4 white protesters that were kind of prosecuted, who were prosecuted for taking part in the removal of the Colston statute. And Marvin Rees doesn't talk about the slave trade. Marvin Rees doesn't talk about racism. He doesn't talk about the democracy. He doesn't talk about any of these statements, anything that any of the acquitted defendants made, including the statement to the effect that they actually removed the statute because it amounted to an insult to the community in Bristol. So what does Marvin Rees kind of represent? He doesn't represent the height of democratic accountability. He doesn't represent opposition to racism. He doesn't represent anything that the protesters against the Colston statute were doing, because since he became elected mayor of Bristol at the expense of Bristol, Rees hasn't done anything against racism, and most certainly not against the continuation of the kind of Colston statute. What happened was that in the Times editorial about Colston, they are saying that instead of putting it in the actual waters, the protesters should have gone about by organizing a general discussion, a democratic kind of they're saying that the correct course, whatever Miss Graham, that is Rhiannon Graham, one of the 4 defendants acquitted, whatever she thinks, the correct course was for the people of Bristol, through a democratic vote, to decide what to do with it. Now, if that is the case, and if that is what Marvin Rees has been doing, then there is no evidence, there is no reference to his role to have that carried out that kind of debate in that piece in the Times. So Marvin Rees is playing the suitable role that would suit racists and racist agenda that Jeremy Corbyn endorses. So we shall come to all of these in due course. Here is the Daily Mail's version of the piece. And the Daily Mail typically is condemning the acquitted four. And in contrast to the Times' editorial, the Daily Mail is condemning the action in their editorial. And the Daily Mail has got a piece by Jonathan Meyerson, which is an extension of the latest corrupt intervention by Maureen Lipman, who is denouncing any non-Jewish actor having the audacity to play a Jewish character like Golda Meir. She's saying that Helen Mirren is the wrong religion to be cast as Golda Meir. And this one kind of moderately criticizing Maureen Lipman. And Angela Rayner is pictured with the caption, Angela Rayner yesterday in heels and a split dress. Now, what is that to do with anything? And this is a piece by the Daily Mail's political sketch writer, Henry Deeds. Now, Deeds must be related to William Deeds, either William Deeds' son or grandson. And he says, as Rayner tackled Boris Johnson of a rising energy course, he replies, she talks about energy. She's got a lot more energy than the current leader of the opposition. That is a quote from Johnson. And behind Johnson, his colleagues roared their appreciation. This was so much more fun than Sir Smarty Pants' weekly whines. After Rayner sat down, the session slumped. The SNP's Ian Blackford also abandoned his fire and brimstone COVID predictions and went about on the cost of living. And Lindsay Hall mistook Ed Davey as Ed Balls, and he corrected himself. So what they're saying in the Daily Mail about the Bristol removal we'll come to the legal process and the Lutfer Roman disgrace. We shall come to that because of the criminal prosecution of Nazir Ahmad. We'll come to that in a minute shortly. The version that is in the Daily Mail, and we shall contextually update our commentary on that. Now, the heading to that particular editorial, which is the third of the four editorial comments in today's Daily Mail, that is, when I say today's Daily Mail, I mean Friday, the 7th of January 2022. Exactly what message about the rule of law does it send out when violent agitators are clearly cleared by a court after brazenly tearing down 17th century slave trader Edward Colston's statue? The four Black Lives Matter protesters claimed it was a political act, not a criminal damage. Inexplicably, the jury agreed. Where does this madness end? With thugs having carte blanche to smash up any public property they don't like in the name of the noble tradition of dissent. Once again, the law is an ass. Now, every word in that Daily Mail editorial is racist, corrupt, illegal. Okay, so we go back to the knighting of Tony Blair, and the heading in the editorial, in the Daily Mail editorial page against Blair reads, Blair's narcissism led him to invade Iraq. The same flaw will make him ignore the clamor to strip him of his knighthood. Now, it's written by Tim Collins, who is described as having been a commanding officer of the 1st Battalion Royal Irish Regiment during the Iraq War. He says that the real leader of the attack on the people of Iraq, the real kind of leader was the Bush administration. So Collins said to prosecute Blair without laying charges against his master, the US president, would be meaningless. We can only wish his incompetence could be treated as a crime. If it were, Blair would be on trial, condemned by the evidence of his own arrogance and addiction to celebrity. A decent man would realize this and even now turn down that tainted knighthood. Ironically, the personal gift of a monarch whose country he took to war on the premise of a lie. So it's about prosecution, right? So you go back to the reference to Nazir Ahmad. Nazir Ahmad is wrongly headed as Labour pedophile peer because Nazir Ahmad left his peerage. He's no longer a peer. And he most certainly is not a Labour peer anymore. However, this is historic. So the one of the persistent criminal denials that I received from the crooked Tar Hamlets Council crooked legal section over many years during the entirety of Lutfur Rahman's incumbence in the post of the corrupt mayor was that many of the claims against the crooks in Tar Hamlets Council, the liars in Tar Hamlets Council, were too old. going back too far in the kind of period of the perpetration and the alleged negligence, lying, corruption, and criminality by Hrs Council. And so therefore they could not be acted on. That is what I was told by all the particular post holder criminals and liars in posts in Hrs Council over many, many, many years. So that's the background. Now here, the Daily Mail, the piece is written by Chris Brook. Brook is spelled with an E at the end. So it says in the descriptive subheading, disgraced politicians fall from grace is complete as he is found guilty of raping a boy and trying to rape a 5-year-old girl 50 years ago. 50 years ago. 50 years is far longer than the crimes that Hrs Council has committed. Crimes that I have brought to the Council's legal section for action, and crimes that have been described as too old. None of those crimes that I did bring, they were not all the crimes that I could bring, but all the crimes that I did bring to the legal section of the Hrs Corrupt Criminal Council, none of those was 50 years old. And yet this particular criminal, Nazir Ahmad, has been found guilty of rape, trying to rape a 5-year-old girl 50 years ago. The downfall of a former Labour peer was complete. Now the headline doesn't say former Labour peer. It says Labour pedophile peer. Doesn't say former. So they want to maximize the publicity value against the Labour Party. That is the factual analysis. Now they're saying that he is now 64 and also known as Lord Ahmed of Rotherham, was found guilty of raping a boy under the age of 11 and attempting to rape a 5-year-old girl almost 50 years ago. His victims went to the police decades later vowing to right the wrongs of our past, and the jury verdicts at Sheffield Crown Court meant they finally saw justice done. Ahmad's older brothers, Muhammad Farooq, 71, and Muhammad Tariq, 65, were deemed unfit to stand trial for indecently assaulting the same boy, but were found by the jury to have done the alleged acts. How did this happen? Not one brother, not two brothers, three brothers were up to these things. Now that actually raises the question that we have been putting mainly about Hrs, but it actually includes the entire, quote, Muslim community. How many Muslim families are allowing this to go on? How many Muslim families have allowed girls, mainly children, in their families to be raped or sexually assaulted and abused by members of their families? And how many of those cases have actually been cited by, quote, Muslim leaders in the mosques? I find no evidence, and this goes back to 50 years, 5 decades, there has been no initiative by the Muslim leaders, either of the mosques or the Muslim communities, so called, taking the initiative, even of acknowledging that children are being sexually abused, targeted, and even raped by Muslims within the community, within the family networks. It applies to Tar Hamlers, it applies to Newham, it applies to Hackney, it applies to all the areas where significant numbers demographically of Muslims inhabit. Now, this Nazir Ahmad conviction refers to Rotherham. Now, Rotherham is one of the main areas where Pakistani origin but British born kind of men have been featuring in the gangs that have been grooming, according to reports, the mainly white girls, children, white girls, that is white children, for sexual exploitation, child sexual exploitation. They've been raped, they've been drugged, they've been prostituted, they've been pimped, they have been seriously, severely, mentally kind of violated. So add the role of this criminal, convicted criminal, Nazir Ahmad. If Nazir Ahmad himself, according to this conviction, had been engaged in sexually exploiting and raping or trying to rape children as far back as 50 years ago, this is what calendar year are they referring to? Let's see again what particular year they're referring to. So they say 50 years ago, but the calendar year, what calendar year are they mentioning? I'm looking for a citation of that calendar year, and so far I haven't found it, but I shall check again. So this one is talking about the grooming scandal that I mentioned earlier, which is a piece by Guy Adams. Sex assaults on women. A dangerous driver who killed a man. An anti-Semite. So how did he grace corridors of power for so long? That is what this piece is saying. Before going into the particular parts of the Guy Adams piece, let's remind anyone viewing this again of the fact that when the crooks in Tar Hamlers plotted to install Lutfur Rahman as the elected mayor on the London Borough of Tar Hamlers Council, they had on their list of celebrity Muslims, or rather celebrity endorsers of that plot, disguised as a Muslim community event or disguised as a Muslim community program to have an elected mayor. because that runs through most of the commentary, legal commentary in the ruling that is authored by Richard Morey, or at least which is published in his name, dated the 23rd of April 2015. Clergy, imams were kind of enrolled to give to the gullibles, Muslims, the quote, quasi religious kind of sermon, advice, order, brainwashing order that propelled them to vote for Lutfur Rahman, saying that it was a Muslim's religious duty to vote for Lutfur Rahman. Could it be the same Lutfur Rahman who was reported elsewhere as having been a fan of the alcohol called the Irish coffee or Irish tea? So a lot of criminality had been going on within the quote Muslim community, so-called, where there was absolutely no adherence to the principles of Islam. And so when on the Saturday, the 6th of February 2010, I led a campaign outside the Brady Center, campaigning and speaking against the plot to foist an elected mayor on the borough of Hamlets, I was approached by George Galloway, who was still a member at the expense of the Bethnal Green Bow constituency, just about another 4 months, starting 4 calendar months. And I refused to give George Galloway the microphone that I was holding. And Galloway's completely false, untruthful, unfounded assumption in asking me to give him the microphone was that I would give him the microphone. And I never gave him the microphone. Now this is the Bangilar campaign that I set up. And one of the things that played a very serious part in my decision to oppose the elected mayor, one of the things, not the only thing, was that Tower Hamlets Council itself was incapable. Tower Hamlets Council was incapable of monitoring the behavior of anyone in the post, either as the leader of the council or as was being promoted as the elected mayor, executive mayor. And this was based on the evidence of the council, since it became operational in April in April 1965. As I said yesterday, there is no evidence the Tower Hamlets Council has behaved in the slightest as a democratically accountable, honestly run local council. So from 1st of April 1965 up to now, and up to the 6th of February 2010, there was no record. And there has been no record since that time. Now, all the failures of the Tower Hamlets Council as a council delivering its duties to out to the people in the borough, of course, highlighted by things like the council's continuing negligence and failure to do the safeguarding children duties owed to the 4 girls from the Bethnal Green school. One of the girls, the first girl that was groomed by the Sisters Forum from the London Muslim Centre base, East London Mosque base, was Sharmina Begum. Sharmina, not Shamima. Sharmina Begum or Sharmima Begum, who was groomed to go to Syria in December 2014. That was a month after George Galloway condemned the then Secretary of State Eric Pickles for the criticism that Pickles made of Luther Roman's regime. Now, Tower Hamlets Council knew, and Luther Roman knew, and Luther Roman should have known that the East London Mosque was paid by that time, by the time that Andrew Gilligan broadcast the Dispatches program on Channel 4 on the 1st of March 2010. That even up to that time, the East London Mosque had been paid public money by the UK government to the tune of £2 million as part of the so-called Prevent program. So although the Prevent program had been criticized by others, or has been criticized by others, calling it a spying program, the East London Mosque was doing the spying on the Muslim community. Now, how many Muslims in Tower Hamlets even actually know that? And how many Muslims, if they actually know that, have done anything to even register their knowledge about that? And how many Muslims have actually examined the role of the Prevent program based in Tower Hamlets, based East London Mosque in Whitechapel Road? And how many of the Prevent program participants or beneficiaries have expressed any concern about the possibility that any Muslim children or any children might be under sexual exploitation, sexually being abused by Muslims in Tower Hamlets? So we go back to Nazir Ahmad, and this one says, so he says that in late 2020, the outwardly respectable community leader, that is Nazir Ahmad, who had been ennobled, that is, who had been put on the House of Peers with great fanfare by Tony Blair, was forced to resign from the House of Peers in disgrace after being found on the balance of probabilities to have sexually abused a young woman. Now, that was in 2020, not 2022. His victim, a single mother of two named Tahira Zaman, was one of several whistleblowers who had bravely contributed to a 2019 BBC Newsnight report that accused the married father of three of routinely using his parliamentary position to pursue sex with highly vulnerable women. So he didn't do the sexual exploitation only 50 years ago. He continued them while he became a member of the House of Peers, made a peer by Tony Blair. In 2017, Miss Zaman suffered from depression and anxiety, contacted Ahmad's parliamentary office after being exploited by a Muslim faith healer. After agreeing to write to Met Police Chief Cressida Dick on her behalf, the peer persuaded her to join him for dinner, after which he sexually assaulted her by placing his hand on the top of her thigh, according to a 260-page report by the Lord's Conduct Committee. A couple of months later, Ahmad asked Miss Zaman to attend a meeting at his East London home. So this criminal actually has a home in East London. He made her a cup of tea, which she believes was spiked with a drug, an allegation he denied, before, as the report put it, sitting on her lap and telling her he was sexually aroused. Later that night, she agreed to have sex with the peer. A 2-month affair ensued, which Miss Zaman said ended only when he made it clear he wasn't going to leave his wife. She added, "He took advantage of me, he abused his power." Several other women told similar tales to Newsnight, alleging that they had approached Ahmed for help or support only to be asked for sexual favors in return. One, speaking anonymously, alleged he basically wanted to sleep with me. Another, this time a man, said he had witnessed Ahmed propositioning a woman who came to him seeking an internship. Though none of the claims aired by Newsnight crossed the threshold for criminal prosecution, they were enough to force his resignation. Days before the publication of the committee's report, which recommended his expulsion from the House of Peers. The coverage of the allegations seems to have motivated his accusers in the recent trial to come forward. Yesterday's conviction completes a remarkable fall from grace for a man who once fated an inspiring role model. Born in Pakistan occupied Kashmir, Nazir Ahmed moved to the UK in 1969 when he was 11, unable to speak a word of English. Although teachers suggested he become a car mechanic, he gained a university degree and became a successful property developer. Having joined the Labour Party aged 18, around the same time he got married, Ahmed moved through the political ranks, becoming Rotherham's first Asian councillor in 1990 and subsequently the town's youngest magistrate. When Tony Blair ennobled him in 1998, he became the third Muslim life bearer at the tender age of 41. Home was by then a large detached house on one of Rotherham's smartest streets, where the couple raised a daughter and two sons. Back then, Ahmad promised to be a voice for the community in the new Labour mold. In keeping with his theme, Ahmad soon began to attract attention for making outspoken remarks about the failures of multiculturalism. In the early 2000s, for example, he criticized the wearing of the face veil, that is the burqa, campaigned against forced marriage, and called for mosque sermons to be delivered in English to aid integration. After the 9/11 terror attacks in 2001, he also called on British Muslims to confront all those who preach hatred. Not all of his contributions to public debate were quite in so well received by progressives. However, in 2005 he hosted a book launch in the House of Peers for a notorious, and in 2006 he invited notorious anti-Semite named Israel Shamir, and in 2006 he invited a suspected Al-Qaeda terrorist to parliament. In 2007, Ahmad described a knighthood awarded to Salman Rushdie, author of these satanic verses, as an insult to Muslims, saying Rushdie had blood on his hands. Fears about his judgment, by then doing the rounds in labor circles, appeared to be confirmed by 2 years later, when Ahmed found himself at the center of an ugly court case. He was convicted of dangerous driving after a Jaguar plowed into the back of a stationary car on the M1 near Sheffield, killing its driver, Slovakian Martin Gomba, 28. Police investigators found Ahmed had sent and received 5 lengthy texts while driving at up to 60 miles per hour on the motorway. The last was sent minutes before the crash. So this is a criminal, comprehensive criminal. Originally sentenced to 12 weeks in prison, he was released after just 16 days when the Court of Appeal suspended the sentence. The affair would, in a roundabout way, lead to his resignation from the Labour Party after he declined to share anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about what had happened to him on a foreign television network in 2013. During an interview with an Urdu language TV station from Pakistan, Ahmed was asked about his time in prison. He responded that the judge who had jailed him had originally been appointed to the High Court after helping Jewish colleague of Tony Blair. Ahmed then blamed the length of his sentence on pressure placed on the courts by Jews who own newspapers and television channels and wanted to punish him for supporting the Palestinians in Gaza. Although he issued a groveling apology when the racist remarks emerged, he was summoned by Labour's National Executive Committee. To avoid an ugly confrontation, he quit the party, sitting as a crossbench peer during the final 7 years before his forced resignation from Parliament. Crown Court appearances are, however, harder to sidestep than political meetings. The fallen peer was granted bail last night and will return for sentencing in 1 month. The many victims who have chronicled his sexual misdemeanors doubtless hope that his next stay in prison is longer than his previous one. Now, this is the man which this piece refers to, his being resident in East London. Now, it doesn't say which East London part, which part of the East London area they are referring to. It could be anywhere. But essentially, this was the man who was repeatedly kind of invited by Lutfur Rahman's kind of group to do walkabouts and do platform speaking for the cause of the post of mayor. On 6th of February 2010, he was there on the platform in the Brady Center. At that time, it was the plan to promote Lutfur Rahman as the first executive mayor. And later, in a later election, probably the 2018 election, mayor election in Tower Hamlets, at which Ohid Ahmed, who was Lutfur Rahman's deputy mayor, before Lutfur Rahman was ousted in April 2015, Ohid Ahmed stood as a candidate for mayor in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. And as part of the Ohid Ahmed candidacy, or as part of the propaganda for Ohid Ahmed's candidacy, the same Nazir Ahmed was promoted by Ohid Ahmed's social media propaganda. Now that was in 2018, which was years after Nazir Ahmed was convicted of dangerous driving and was sent to prison. So the question is, why did Ohid Ahmed invite the convicted criminal? And according to this same piece in the Daily Mail, well, we're going by the factual aspects of this, not the Daily Mail's agenda. The Guy Adams piece. Ahmed had already been known about as a sexual abuser of people, because according to this one, in 2017, this woman called Tahira Zaman, who may have been using a pseudonym, but let's call her Miss Zaman, who suffered from depression and anxiety and contacted Ahmad's parliamentary office after being exploited by a Muslim faith healer. Now, she was seeking help from another sexual exploiter, Muslim. I mean, it's widespread. So why did this woman approach him? Could be naivety, or could be somebody else told her to do that. What we shall be doing is go back to the accessible versions of the document now. This one, he says, has got 260-page report by the Lord's Conduct Committee. We should look at the Conduct Committee report and further examine Ahmad's behavior. And we shall continue to ask the question, if the elected mayor post was being kind of supported by the likes of him, doesn't that show the corruption in the post? There are no right-minded people or right-thinking people would be kind of endorsing it. A pervert, a sexual abuser of children and women, and now a convicted one. Nazir Ahmed and his conviction and his career should serve as evidence that as a whole, Muslim community in the UK, the ordinary people, ordinary members in the community are being let down, betrayed, and ill-served by the so-called leaders. And that includes those Muslims who are installed in positions as, for example, positions in the East London Mosque. There is no record, there is no evidence that any Muslim center, so-called, has acknowledged the internal criminality, rape, sexual abuse, child sex, exploitation and abuse done by Muslims within the Muslim community. Which means that Muslims are, in the main, these leaders, in the main, and those that support these leaders and promote them, or stooge for them, are doing the right thing. And it's essentially, it's a criminal network of, quote, Muslim named leaders. Now, we go back to Friday's, well, it's not Friday, it's dated the 8th of January, that is Saturday, which is the Irish Post. Irish Post says that it has been the voice of Irish community in Britain since 1970. That's 52 years. And the reason I'm putting this before the camera is the heading, the year of our language, that is the Irish language. And this is not a very deeply thoughtful piece, but contextually it is important as a reference. And it says that the President of Ireland, that is the Republic of Ireland, has called on its people to renew their relationship with their native tongue this year as the Irish language achieves full working status within the European Union. Irish Gaelic now has full official and working status in the EU institutions, putting it on par with all the other official languages of the European Union. So that is true, and that will happen. But the piece doesn't actually go in depth into the reason why the Irish language is only now being kind of referred to in that way. The language is being used at this time. What happened to hundreds of years? Which takes us back to tar hamlets and to the article by Leslie Garner in the Sunday Times on the 2nd of December 1973, in which Leslie Garner attacked the Siloti language and the Siloti speaking people. Now, Siloti language and Siloti language speaking people in 1971 in the UK, in the rest of the world, outside of Bangladesh or outside of then East Pakistan, were the largest group of people speaking one language. And Siloti language speakers in 1971 were the ones that took the leading part, the main substantial part, during the whole of the 9 months in supporting the cause of Bangladesh and in attacking the attacks on East Pakistan by the military Pakistan army. My father was one of the organizers of the support for Bangladesh in 1971 in London. And he organized one of the largest groups of people from the eastern side of Silot that came to his address in New Road throughout the period. Okay, so we take a look at the other trial, the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell, which has become the subject of the kind of call for retrial of the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell. Let's put a number of things there. Any retrial, I mean, the Fleet Street newspapers have been giving Ghislaine Maxwell the status of royalty. They have been, even when she has been convicted, they have been giving her publicity about her socialite status and her alleged kind of being allegedly victimized because of her being a woman. But the testimony that was presented to the court in New York during the trial by her victims, or those victims that actually were exploited and raped, etc., shows that she was the monster that they called her. Now, this line that the Times newspaper is running, and it is common line that the rest of Fleet Street has been running, that the juror who has said that he had been sexually abused and therefore he said in post-conviction statement that the fact that he had been himself a victim of sexual abuse convinced or helped him convince the other jurors of the impact that sexual exploitation had on him. So he said that it helped them understand the position of victims of sexual abuse. Now, what the Ghislaine Maxwell side have done with that statement, predictably, is that there was a mistrial because he didn't disclose, they are claiming, he didn't disclose the fact that he had been a victim of child sex exploitation. Because if he had been if he had disclosed that fact, they're saying, if he had disclosed that fact, then he would not be allowed to sit on the jury, which is probable. Let's accept that. But the fact that he was allowed to sit as a jury, as a member of that jury, and the fact that he has actually claimed, he has not been lying, he has said that he helped the other jurors who are not exploited to understand what it is like, or it was like for a victim of the sexual exploitation. Now, all of that accepted still doesn't mean that having a retrial, if one is actually held, will exonerate Ghislaine Maxwell of her crimes. Whatever the composition of the new retrial cannot hide the evidence and cannot forget the evidence. So this is the view that I am making clear, that there should not be assuming that a retrial will exonerate her and acquit her. So we shall put that at that point and we shall wait to see what happens next. Now, there is a piece on page 2 of the Times of Friday, the 7th of January 2022, where it reports Johnson attacking vaccine refuseniks who spread mumbo jumbo. Now let's put it in the scientific way. If there is a vaccine that has never been existing, that never existed before, if there is a vaccine that is being circulated and kind of put to people to be vaccinated by, isn't this acceptable to ask questions about various aspects of it? How is it that asking questions about the vaccine amounts to mumbo jumbo or amounts to conspiracy theories? The government has got the fullest responsibility to publish all the aspects of the vaccine everywhere. And let's put it on the record about Johnson and Kerry Simmons. Going by the record of Johnson in terms of marriages and weddings, Johnson, his first wife, he left his first wife, divorced, and then he divorced his second wife, who is Marina Wheeler, and Kerry is his third wife. There is absolutely no guarantee that Kerry will be his last wife. Why? Because of so many allegations. There are enough allegations about their relationship in terms of her interfering with his government that can only increase. And the census, the 1921 census, that's what they're saying, reveals a nation at war with its leaders. And there is a letter in the Times about animals' rights. And it says, though one hesitates to argue with so eminent a zoologist as Desmond Morris, his prescription for the rights that might be conferred on animals, while few could disagree with the sentiments, leaves nearly everything still to be determined. What would be a sufficient physical and social environment for zoo animals, and what might constitute a deprived environment for farm animals? Laws expressed in such general terms provide no certainty for those affected by them or those who must enforce them. They leave everything to be fashioned by pressure groups taking their cause to the courts. Specific regulations of the kind we already have for the standards to be observed by zoos and farms are more useful. Now, there is a letter from the treasurer of the Criminal Bar Association, person called Lori Ann Power. It's about the Colston statute trial verdict. The government is right to maintain that criminal damage remains an offense, and we, the electorate, are right to insist on maintenance of our democratic right to be tried by a jury in criminal cases such as these. Barely a year ago, both main political parties contemplated removing the right to a jury trial for many either were offenses. The possibility of judge only trials, accompanied by two lay magistrates, as a means of tackling a growing case backlog, was also considered. Both these cost saving ideas would compromise justice. The Colston verdict is proof that juries bring a collective wisdom and objectivity to cases, not just in the more routine cases, but in the most factually and legally complicated ones. As the Lamy review into the criminal justice system highlighted, a jury of 12 remains essential to preventing discrimination and prejudice, bringing together local people from different socioeconomic backgrounds and reflecting our multi-ethnic and multicultural society. This verdict demonstrates the sound judgment of local juries and the British born principle that justice is to be derived of the people, by the people, for the people. Now, this is a racist letter, although it refers to David Lamy's review. It is a racist letter because it says British born. This whole thing is a confection based on the American born, by the people, for the people, the Lincoln's, Abraham Lincoln's kind of statement. And the Guardian, of course, is celebrating the toppling of the Colston statue. So 2 pages inside. So there is this report leading the Financial Times of Friday, the 7th of January 2022, with the speech that Biden gave on the anniversary of the Capitol riots on the 6th of January 2021. And this is Biden fears threat to democracy 1 year on from Capitol assault. And we shall be talking in due course about democracy under threat. There is an editorial in the Financial Times about the rule of law under threat in Poland. And it says, that protecting the European Union legal order is a big test for von der Leyen. And it ends with the paragraph, Poland's government will relish a clash with Brussels and complain it is the victim of the EU overreach. In reality, this is about the ruling party's domestic excess. Poles sadly pay the price for it while their country is being marginalized in Europe. On the same editorial page, there is a piece by somebody named John Reed. Now, John Reed is an idiot. It's a notebook. It says Myanmar notebook. It's a Burma notebook, and it says massacre fuels call for vote on UN arms embargo. Now, this is continuing Fleet Street's denial of the Burmese genocide of Muslims. And it doesn't mention the Rohingyas. And that gives away the game. So we shall come to an end of this probably just under 3 hours. So